Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of the IEFA Conversation Series. My name is Joe Miller, and I am the Frankfurt correspondent at the Financial Times. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Christian Levin, the chief executive of Scania. Scania, as you will all know, one of the world's largest truck makers, and a business that often finds itself, dare I use this cliche, at the crossroads, at the intersection of geopolitics, of energy politics, of every little rupture in the global supply chain tends to find itself being felt in the boardrooms of companies like Scania. So delighted to have you with us today, Christian. Thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure.
I thought we'd jump in then with the situation that is occupying all of our thoughts, and indeed all of our professional thoughts as well at this time. And that is, of course, the war in Ukraine. And it's worth pointing out that obviously the war in Ukraine did not create the current crisis that we're in. It has exacerbated a crisis that has already existed, that people like you have been dealing with, a supply chain crisis that's been going on for a couple of years. I guess it would be good to know, how deeply are your supply chains under stress? How does, this week and this month compare to before the invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, so you're right, Joe. The stress on the supply chain is unfortunately nothing new. We've been living with this now on and off for more than a year. And of course, it started as a result of COVID and as a result of a number of some calls it the perfect storm. There was a winter storm in Texas. There was a fire in Japan. When suddenly these little semiconductors got very, very difficult to get hold of. So I think we've been in a non-stable situation since early months last year. And of course, anything coming on top of that, such as the war in Ukraine, is of course immediately or down the line risking to further create disturbances. Our global supply chains are, they are global first of all, but they are also so tightly interconnected between each other. So from our first tiers to the second tiers, third tiers, and all the way into raw materials and energy, everything has an impact. And that's the beauty, or that's the backside of globalization, if you would like. So what happens in this case with Ukraine is that we, of course, first start to look in, okay, which are our first tier suppliers, and if no first tier, are there second tier suppliers, and if not, and then you continue down that line, and then you try to find alternative sources, and luckily many times many of our suppliers are multi-site and multi-region, so we managed to get supply out of other corners. But every limitation creates another A, risk for shortage, and B, a probable cost increase. So what we see all, regardless where we are, regardless of which business, all of these things will eventually or are already creating inflation and cost increase.
Yeah, I'll come on to the cost increases in a second, but I thought maybe I should just mention, for those who aren't familiar with the ins and outs of the semiconductor crisis that you mentioned there, which may sound like it's a computing crisis, but modern vehicles, especially modern trucks, have loads and loads of semiconductors that power everything from windows going up and down to far more complex things like navigation, etc. So not having semiconductors is a real problem for a modern automaker and a modern truck maker. Just in regards to the Ukraine conflict, we've heard a lot about wiring harnesses being a problem which are manufactured in Ukraine. And one of the problems is that you need sort of wiring harnesses, these sort of electrical cables that connect a car or a truck. You need them just to begin to build, whereas with a semiconductor, sometimes you can sort of wait a little while until you get the piece for a certain part of the vehicle. Is this more acute than the semiconductor crisis was, in terms of like stopping production or having an effect on immediate day-to-day work?
So you're right. When it comes to semiconductors, It really depends in which control system the particular semiconductor actually sits. And as you mentioned, there are many. We'd say there are at least 5,000 semiconductors on a modern commercial vehicle today. There could be up to 10,000 depending on the specification and the complexity. Yes, some of them you can live without, maybe a window winder, the driver can live without, and we can retrofit that at a later stage. So we can even deliver it to customer. If we talk about the engine control system, we cannot even get the vehicle off the assembly line because it's supposed to drive off the assembly line. So without an engine control, you're lost. So when it comes to cable harnesses, where some manufacturers in our industry have problems because of Ukraine being a very big supplier market. Yes, that's true what you say. That's kind of the blood system of a vehicle, and you mount that very early in the production process, and you usually order them in what we call a sequence, meaning that there's one individual cable harness for every vehicle, because it depends on the specification that the customer has chosen, and we're in the business B2B, where much of the trucks we supply are tailor-made. So to build a vehicle without this is not an option. It's not something you can retrofit. So from that perspective, it's one-to-one. You have it, you can build a vehicle. You don't have it, you can't build a vehicle. So of course that is extremely serious. If we compare it to the semiconductor, it also has some similarities, and that is the difficulty to just buy it from somewhere else. So whereas the semiconductor, you build that up on a motherboard with a specific software to a specific functionality, meaning it's very difficult to shift it over to just another one. And when it comes to the cable harness, it's exactly the same. You create a supply chain that is really dedicated to your factories, and you cannot just start to take that from someone else, but it's months and years of preparations to be ready for that. So of course that's creating a much more stress on our industry, including the whole automotive industry, by the way. So just another difficulty that we need to handle in this global crisis.
And it must feel personally for you like you're lurching from crisis to crisis, as how we've hardly had a moment to breathe. But is there a sense that you are able to tackle this crisis a little bit better than the last one? Because I remember when the semiconductor crisis started, it took a few weeks for everyone to work out what was going on. And now with the invasion of Ukraine, it took maybe a few days until we heard that, there are issues with wiring harnesses. So it seemed that perhaps the supply chains had been, modified to a point where the warning signs come up a little bit earlier. Is that fair to say?
I hope you're right. It's of course difficult to say on the kind of on the average, but yes, we are in constant crisis mode, and we have created a lot of resilience in our supply chains through the crisis we've been in. So I hope that you're right. I hope that we were faster this time to understand that A, this is serious. B, don't hope for improvement, but act immediately. And C, even if it costs some money to start to create fallback solutions, go for all of them. Don't hope for the best, so to say, but rather plan for the worst, which means that, okay, plan for this war to last a very long time, and plan for multiple fallback solutions in parallel, because it's just so critical. So if I speak for my company, I can for sure say that we are much better prepared for disturbances in general, regardless what creates them. But that there is a cost in the end, that there is no doubt. So that is the price that we eventually have to pay. But the worst thing you can have is that you cannot satisfy your customer, that you cannot deliver on your promises. So anything is better than that. That goes without saying. So these costs we just have to take on.
And of course, consumer demand has been booming in the wake of the pandemic, which leads me on to something that you mentioned before, which is inflation. And one of the reasons I said at the beginning that a company like Scania and truck makers feel sort of every bump in the geopolitical road is because it's very different to selling, passenger cars, where you're selling desire a lot of the time, and you're pushing a product that people perhaps don't need but want, whereas all of your customers need their product and have a very rational choice to make, and they make that choice based on something called TCO, which is total cost of ownership, and they want to know basically how much it's going to cost them to run a truck over its lifetime. Now we're seeing inflation not just in the costs that you are seeing, but also in the cost of running a truck because of commodity prices going up. How is that affecting your business? How is that affecting your order book and your customers?
So you're completely right. We're of course extremely exposed to those increases, and in our value chains there's so many materials, there's so many different components, there's a lot of energy, of course. So of course it's gradually coming to us as cost increases into our product cost. At the same time, we are, and this is the good thing, we're living in times of, as you said, after the pandemic, the consumer demand has come back much quicker than anyone could have expected, so that we see all-time utilization of the truck fleets. So as we have virtually all of our vehicles are connected, and we download data every minute, every day, we see that not only the most modern part of the fleet is rolling, but also very old vehicles are taking, vehicles that normally stand parked, for Christmas hikes or Eastern hikes, but they are now constantly taken into operation because there's just such a demand for transport in the world. And of course, that's very good, because that's a sign that the world economy is actually doing well. And as you're into, it's not only consumption, it's also investments are coming back very, very, very strongly. So that's of course the positive thing. The negative thing is that we have to take on this cost increases, and our answer to that is of course to adjust our prices. Luckily, I am heading a brand that is living from the lowest total cost of ownership in the industry, and the biggest influence on total cost of ownership in our industry is fuel. And fuel cost has just outgrown, as energy cost goes up, they just outgrow other costs, so that they're proportionally becoming even more expensive. So in a way, my upper hand is getting stronger in relation to some of my competitors that cannot deliver vehicles that are so have so low fuel consumption. But the overall picture is, of course, that transport is going to get much more expensive, like everything else, because in the end, someone will have to pay. So even if I'm successful in translating the cost increases into price increases of my products and services, and they are accepted by my customers, they will have to increase the price of the transport. And many transporters are protected against specifically fuel prices. It's very, very, very usual that you have it's very common that you have a clause in your transport contract with an indexation towards diesel price or other energy prices. So usually you can offset that. So I think the ultimate thing that will happen is that, yes, transport will become more expensive, and especially transport that is depending on traditional fossil fuels. And then we'll have to see what is the effect. Will that dampen consumption? Now, in developed economies such as Europe, transport and logistics is a very small part of the total cost of whatever we consume. I think in Europe it's between 6 and 7%. So if that 6-7% increase, even 10%, it's less than a percentage point on the total cost. So I'm not so worried for that. I'm more worried than for other inflationary tendencies in the entire economy that will spill over into salary increases and into a bad spiral where everything is just going to get more expensive. But that's how I see the impact on the supply chain, specifically in our industry.
It's so interesting you point out there that you're basically waiting to see who balks first at the price increases, so your customers may be able to swallow it, but the question is whether their customers, whether the consumers, whether the people who are getting Amazon parcels delivered, if they're told, it now costs you a few more euros to get your parcel delivered, will they, choose to buy it down the road instead, or will consumer habits change? And of course, we have another pressure on the trucking industry, which is it's very hard to get people to drive trucks at the moment. It's very difficult to find people. So you have all of these pressures. And I just wondered how long you think it'll take until you get an answer to that, until you sitting in your boardroom know what consumer, till that feedback sort of from consumers filters all the way back to you?
Yeah, that's always the $1 million question, and then you ask yourself, when that happened, what is the quality of my order book, and which will be the number of cancellations, and how can I then adapt my production system to going from some kind of a almost full capacity utilization, depending on the availability of semiconductors, and then to the new level where demand is going to sit. And of course that's the name of the game in our industry. The most flexible is usually the one that wins over time. So of course that's something that we discuss every day, basically. But so far, as I was into, transport demand is very high, utilization is very high, and we see further strong order intake coming into our order book. So it seems that so far, despite the COVID, despite the shortages, despite increases in cost, despite the war in Europe, it seems that the transport demand just continues, which is a little bit odd, to be honest. I would also not have expected that. I would have expected to start to see a dampening effect, but it's not coming. It will. At some point, it will come. I mean, the economy is cyclic by its nature, and the question is just when it's going to happen. And at that point, of course, it would be much more comfortable to not have a huge order book, because the risk is that you have this, that it continues and continues, and then it just disappears. And we saw, those of us who were around back in the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. Of course, we saw that catastrophic scenario happening where between 50 and 80%, depending on markets, just disappeared. Not just the demand for new orders, but actually the order book. So that is the nightmare scenario. And I don't think that will happen this time. I think we have, as I said, better quality in the order book. We have better control over the orders. But it is something you have to have as part of your preparations when you think of the different scenarios.
It seems so different to previous crises. It doesn't seem to be following the same pattern, and I guess we're all just sort of waiting to see how things turn out. Talking of looking into a crystal ball towards the future, obviously one of the big challenges that your industry and your company is facing is the transformation to greener technology, to greener trucks, to hydrogen powered trucks, battery powered trucks, whatever they may be, that are more environmentally friendly than diesel powered trucks. One of the questions that we all have is, what has this pandemic and now this war done to those ambitions, and what are these high commodity prices going to do to those ambitions? Is it a delaying factor, or is it in fact an accelerator?
Yeah, this is of course the most important question, and I mean our responsibility is of course to drive this shift just as soon as possible, and we've made it our purpose in Scania to be the one who had the industry in this new direction. Yeah, this is a bit of a crystal ball question, of course, but we've asked for a number of things. When we were in Glasgow speaking to the larger community and to policymakers, there were a couple of asks. One was, of course,
this is at the climate conference in Glasgow.
Yeah, that's the climate conference in Glasgow. Yeah, that took place last year. One very important thing is, of course, it has to be financially viable for us, our customers, to invest in new equipment, and being electric, being hydrogen, and that will happen by itself if we just extrapolate different curves, cost of battery technology, cost of hydrogen technology, but cost of energy, cost of diesel, taxes, etc. And when we put all of that together, we see that, okay, this is going to happen depending on which type of transport, starting basically 2025, 26, 27, 28. If we get policymakers' help, this can go faster. And one thing we were asking for and have been asking for very continuously is, let's put a price on carbon. We have seen in other industries that it does work and it does really help. And if we can, on a European level, get the price on carbon and then get an increase over time on that price, there will for sure be a fast transition, because that's a very smart way then to stimulate transition into either non-fossil liquid fuels such as biodiesel, or into gas fuels, biogas, or into electric vehicles, then that would be a very good thing. And then coming back to our discussion then around what is happening now with extreme increases in fuel costs, well, that could of course be an accelerator towards other fuels, let's put it like that. But what I've seen so far is that the biofuels increase just as fast as the fossil fuels. So, okay, no real help there. But electricity cost, well, it's also going up, but it's going up less fast than the liquid fuel. So from that perspective, it should be a help in the transition towards more electromobility, also on commercial vehicle side. But that takes me to the second ask we made in Glasgow, and that was to policymakers and help us with the build out of the charging infrastructure, because that's the next question our customers are asking. I mean, when they have figured out that, okay, financially it makes sense, then it will be okay, I can charge along the route where I'm doing my transport, either at my depot or at the destination where I'm uncharged, or along the road if this is a longer transport. And there we need to see an acceleration. And I think that this crisis could actually help. We realize that we need to be more resilient. We need to have electricity available in the places where electricity is consumed. And that goes both for depots, destinations, and highways. It is very clear that we are by no means ready. If you compare how many places we have fuel stations, and then you compare to the places you can charge an electric vehicle, of course, there's like a factor 1,000 in between. And therefore, we have taken, together with our mother company, Traton, the decision to go with Volvo and Daimler into a charging JV to ourselves show the way and invest into charging infrastructure as one way. But we will not be able to cover, because we're talking about the huge demand. In our studies, only Europe, we talk about between 25 and 40,000 charging points for the only commercial vehicles. So it is a big journey. So I think, but these are like two things that I think are not negatively impacted by the crisis, but could rather actually be accelerated by the crisis in Ukraine. And of course, I hope so. You cannot say that you get anything positive out of such a horrible thing as a war, but at least if this is helping, okay, then it was perhaps,
Yeah, something not entirely miserable.
No.
Interesting that you mentioned there the carbon price, and of course you're not alone among the truck makers in calling for a carbon price for many years. I wonder, not to put this too insensitively, but given what you've said there, does this war and the supply shock that it's created effectively act as a carbon price, because it has made fossil fuels that much more expensive, probably more expensive than a carbon price would have?
Yes, it does. It does. So actually, in the systems where there is a carbon price, it tends to go down. Strangely, don't ask me to explain why that is happening, but it's going down. But you're right. It acts as an artificial price on carbon as fuel prices come up. And that, of course, as electricity is going up less, it makes the electric vehicle more interesting, provided that we can then supply the electric vehicle at the cost that we currently do. And then comes the outstanding question mark, and that is, of course, a battery electric vehicle, especially the battery as such, contains quite a lot of metals. And if these metals will then become substantially more expensive because of lack or scarcity of certain metals, then, well, it's difficult to foresee the effect of that, but that could be a counteracting force. If that force is strong enough, it will just take out this disadvantage that has been created through the high fuel prices. So here we come into an area where it's very difficult to predict and what it's going to be of what magnitude. But so far, I can say that the price of the fossil fuel is actually supporting the transition over to electric vehicles, and we're having more requests for electric trucks and electric buses than we've ever had. before, and of course, yeah, and that of course I you know, that's fantastic. You know, that is very, very good.
And just briefly, you mentioned there, you know, the raw materials. So, you know, we're talking about things like cobalt and nickel and lithium, which are going up by enormous, eye-watering amounts. If that continues, does it shift the equation towards hydrogen vehicles more, or is it still sort of much of a muchness?
Yeah, you know, in theory, it would do so, because it contains less of these metals. I mean, a fuel cell vehicle is basically a battery electric vehicle with less batteries, plus fuel cell, plus tanks, plus a lot of cooling equipment. You know, so you're right, it could, but the reason that we in Scania believe that the battery electric vehicle will be the dominant technology ahead of fuel cell is not really based on the difference in vehicle costs. It's really based in the difference in energy consumption. So if we depart from the assumption that energy / electricity will never be for free, and it feels safe to do that assumption right now, and then knowing that the losses going from green electricity and transitioning over the catalytic process and then back over the fuel cell into electricity on the track, you lose about 75% of the energy content that you started with. So some way you have to compensate for that 75% of losses. Whereas in an battery electric track, you also have some losses because of internal friction and heat losses, but it's rather in the range of 25%. So 3 times more losses. The capital expenditure that you as a truck buyer has to do, where then potentially the fuel cell vehicle would be slightly less expensive towards the battery electric vehicle, would not, I assume, overtake the fact that you still lose that much energy, and especially as energy now tends to be more expensive and not less expensive. So but that is, you know, different. Our different competitors all say different things. Here is obviously we all base this on assumptions. So, you know, future is going to have to tell, you know, but that's how Scania sees it, and that's also how the TRATON Group sees it. We bet predominantly on the battery electric vehicle technology as per now.
And as you mentioned before, it's hard enough getting a charging infrastructure up for one technology. Let's hope we don't have to do it double for both. Thank you very much, Christian, for joining us. I'm afraid we're running out of time very, very quickly. That was an incredibly insightful discussion. So thank you for your time. Thank you everyone for watching, and please do stay tuned for further installments in this IEFA conversation series. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.